There are suddenly all sorts of warnings coming from the political right in this country. Now, I'm not talking about Christian fascists. They are gone. They're beyond reach, or as used to be, expression used to be used, beyond the pale. They're gone. And as Joe Walsh pointed out, there's no way to reach these Trump cultists. It would be like asking an evangelical Christian to give up her religion. That's not going to happen. Unless there's extreme circumstances, unless that believer in the evangelical bullshit finds herself being raped by the local minister, and even then, probably wouldn't give it up. But I digress. More and more conservative former politicians like Joe Walsh, or I'm going to quote one here in a moment, a former judge, a former federal judge, are coming up with these urgent warnings that the existence of American democratic values and the way we govern ourselves is under serious assault and may end. All it takes is violence, and the Trumpists are willing and able and ready to resort to whatever violence is necessary. For them, it's an existential situation, too, because of their racism and their ingrown brains, if their inability to see history for what it is, a recording of what has happened and how to avoid some of the horrible mistakes that have been made, and the signs that point to a very livable existence of people getting along, of working with nature, of just living together, of acting like we have common interests, which we do. But I'm getting way off track here. Greg Sargent had a piece up today at the Washington Post, and he talks about how Trump is telling us exactly, the orange vomit is exactly how he intends to rerun his coup attempt, should the conditions allow it in 2024. And unless this Electoral Count Act of 1887 is reformed, the conditions for Trump to effect a coup in 2024 are definitely right there. The orange vomit regularly flaunts his view that attempting to overturn the 2020 loss was the right thing to do, even as he continues to install these fascist loyalists one by one in positions of control over the 2024 election, all the way down to the precinct level. The people that are being put in positions of control, not necessarily power yet, but of control, are people who would do whatever Trump said because they are as sick as he is. Greg Sargent says it's a depressing fact about this moment and about our country that most Republicans do not see all this as disqualifying for somebody who wants to run for president in 2024. They don't. And that's the part that has been a mind fuck to me, and I think to most people who have been observing this. You know, the question again and again and again, what is wrong with these people other than their inherent racism and their fear of life, their fear of living? Well, I guess that pretty much answers my question, doesn't it? Well, anyway, the question that is being brought up over and over and over again now is, will Republicans at least try to make such an outcome, Trump trying to steal the election again in 2024, less likely to succeed? Boy, that is a question, isn't it? So Sargent talks about a widely respected conservative former federal judge who wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. And in that op-ed, he issued an urgent warning about Trump's intentions that makes very clear what the stakes are: democracy or Trump fascism. And in this op-ed, the former federal judge, his name is J. Michael Luttig, L-U-T-T-I-G. He makes what he calls the conservative case for reforming the Electoral Count Act of 1887, or the ECA it's called, for the express reason that if we don't do that, it's going to make it both easier and predictable that Trump will steal the 2024 election. Now, as Greg points out, this should be a seminal moment in the debate over this act, the ECA. It also should make it harder for Republicans to keep playing the role of apologists about January 6th and about Trump's future intentions. Now, by apologists, you know what I'm saying. That the January 6th insurrection, the terror attack on this country, was okay. It wasn't that big of a deal. I don't mean to suggest they're apologizing for anything. They are stating the case that what happened on January 6th was normal. You heard what the Republican National Committee issued the other day. So anyway, this former Judge Luttig minces no words. He declares that Trump and his allies pose, quote, a clear and present danger to our democracy. They are preparing to exploit the ECA to seize the presidency in 2024 if Trump or his anointed candidate is not elected by the American people. So the warning is there. I mean, it's all right in front of us. This is the center of what is just driving me crazy. And you know that if you listen to this podcast on a regular basis. Why are the media and the institutions in this country, I said this yesterday, not screaming every chance they get? Why are the Democratic politicians not pointing out what this rotten Nazi son of a bitch is trying to do, Trump? Now, how do we know he's trying to do this? Well, the bastard told us so. He told us he was going to do it. Luttig, the judge, former judge, calls himself a staunch conservative. He was appointed, by the way, by George Herbert Walker Bush. And he notes that Trump recently declared that Mike Pence should have, quote, overturned the election, end quote. I mean, right there is Trump's admission that he lost and that what's his name? Pence should have overturned the election. And Luttig points out that in saying that, Trump signaled that he thinks the ECA's ambiguities in the law provide a way to do just that, overturn an election, and that he's damn sure going to do it again. Now, as Greg points out, the key nuance here is that the threat next time will not be the vice president abusing her powers, Kamala Harris, to count legitimate electors. Rather, the threat stems from the problems in the ECA itself. As the former federal judge puts it, here's how ECA reform should address those problems. This is what he had in his op-ed piece. He wrote, quote, Congress should formally give the federal courts, up to and including the Supreme Court, the power to resolve disputes over state electors and to ensure compliance with the established procedures for selecting presidential electors, and require the judiciary's expeditious resolution of these disputes. Congress should then require itself to count the votes of electors that the federal courts have determined to be properly certified under state law. End quote. Now, I'm sure it might have leaped out at you or leapt out at you in my reading that, what this judge said, when he says up to and including the Supreme Court, the federal courts should have the power to resolve these disputes. Well, wasn't that done on December 13th, 2020? When December 13th, 2000, Jesus, Mike, when the Supreme Court ruled that the vote counting in Florida had to stop, even though it wasn't completed. Because, now this is a different case altogether, obviously in different sort of circumstances. But what the Supreme Court ruled was that George W. Bush, his presidency, his attempt to become president, might be seriously dislodged and upset if the vote counting continued. Now, to me and to other people, that's the day that signaled the death knell, the real death knell of democracy in this country. But I digress. Here's what Luttig means when he wrote that Congress should require itself to count the electors and so on and so forth. He wants to address the scenario that's been reported on by a number of writers, which is a single governor in a state ready to decide the election may send sham electors for the losing candidate in defiance of the state's popular vote, and a Republican-controlled U.S. House of Representatives counts them as legitimate. Under the current law, the ECA, those electors would count, even if the Senate refused to count them. That's because under current law, both chambers, House and Senate, must sustain objections to electors for them to be invalidated. So if a complaint is registered and both houses are under control of, say, the fascist Christian Party, those claims will be immediately rejected. It doesn't make any difference how the voting really went. So, as Greg points out, one answer is for the Electoral Count Act of 1887 to the reform of that act to create a judicial review process that's required after a state certifies electors. That has been suggested by a number of legal scholars in this country as a way out of this, what's coming in 2024. Now, with that reform, if the ECA is reformed, if a governor or state legislature appoints fake electors, then the courts would declare that only electors appointed in accordance with the popular vote are real. Now, my opinion is that the Electoral College should be thrown to the goddamn garbage where it belongs. But I doubt that that's going to happen. So a reformed Electoral Count Act would require Congress to count only the legitimate electors. But what happens if a fascist Christian-led House of Representatives ignores that law and counts the fake electors? Well, here the reform of the ECA could direct the Supreme Court to resolve that dispute after January 6th, which is the date where these electors' votes have to be counted, which is in keeping with the law stating that only the correct electors count. But resorting to the Supreme Court decision, this Supreme Court, this is where I kind of get real shaky about this. Now, all of this that I've just shared with you is in keeping with what former Judge Luttig proposes, having this validated as a conservative reform is supposedly a step forward. This is not being advocated by liberals, but by a traditional conservative former federal judge. It's been said that Luttig is a conservative legal giant who was on the short list to be a Supreme Court justice for a decade. And there is no one whose view matters more in defining the Electoral Count Act reform as in keeping with conservative principles. Yeah, really. I know it's hard for people to believe, but at one time, the conservatives in this country really did believe that the law is the law and should be followed. Not anymore. Now, the former federal judge Luttig also suggests raising the threshold for Congress to invalidate electors. And he suggests this in order to guard against Congress refusing to count correctly appointed electors based on how the popular vote in their state went. Greg points out that people worry that judicial review is an insufficient defense against these bastards. But here's this. It's basically either that, judicial review, or a situation in which some freak like Kevin McCarthy makes the decision about which electors count, which is what we're heading for in 2024, especially when the Democrats lose control of the House this year, which is going to happen because nobody is taking seriously what these fascist bastards are doing. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcasts. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.